Welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, a podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about Boston Strangler. No, we're not going to do a true crime episode on the actual serial killer. We are going to be talking about the movie Boston Strangler. This came out last week, I believe. I did have the opportunity to sit down and watch it, and I wanted to discuss it. So Boston Strangler stars Keira Knightley, and she plays Loretta McLaughlin, and Carrie Coon plays Jean Cole. These women were very pivotal in the capture of the Boston Strangler, and they were also working for the newspaper out of Boston that ended up actually coining his name. So they came up with the name Boston Strangler, and they kind of helped the police department sort of start looking in the direction of this isn't just a string of random killings happening all in the same area, that this is potentially the same person. Look at how similar these things are. So this was taking place in the 1960s, and this would have been before even the term serial killer was a thing, before people knew that serial killings were actually taking place and pretty commonplace, I would say, back in that time period. I want to say for sure I enjoyed Boston Strangler a lot more than I enjoyed the television series that recently came out about Jeffrey Dahmer. It isn't that I didn't think that the actor who portrayed Jeffrey Dahmer in the series did a terrible job or that the show was bad. I just think in that series in particular, it kind of went down an avenue that I did not think was particularly respectful of the people who had lost their lives to Dahmer. I think a lot of it was very... There were a lot of memes, and I understand that the makers of a television series can't control the audience, but there were a lot of memes and stuff going around of people kind of thirsting after the actor because of his portrayal of Jeffrey Dahmer. I know the families also really did not respect the fact that they had done this television series. Just because, obviously a lot of the family members of victims that had been killed were still alive, still around. It is a lot easier, I feel like, for them to have gone on with something like Boston Strangler because it took place in the early 1960s, and therefore there are not a lot of people still kind of living that would remember a lot of what had happened at that time. But where Boston Strangler, I feel like, does it a little bit, well, a lot more respectfully, is that this film really comes from the perspective of the two women working for this Boston newspaper and kind of what their role was, and them sort of having to fight back against the police department, which was predominantly, if not entirely, male-driven, and the newspaper that they worked for, which was also pretty male-driven. And kind of just come forward and say, look, we know what we're looking at. We're almost doing a better job than the police department is doing. And it was through sort of their actions that Albert DeSalvo ended up actually getting caught, because they were sort of like dogs with bones, essentially. They were absolutely not going to let the story go. And it came at the detriment of their personal lives, their home lives, the lives and time that they got to spend with their husbands and their children. Because back in the 1960s, it would not have been the way it is now, where it is very commonplace for women to be in the workforce. This would have been fairly rare, and in a lot of cases looked down upon, for women to have had full-time jobs and been away from their families, not home to cook dinner and all of that good stuff. So I really enjoyed just kind of seeing this from a different perspective. And because it is from the perspective of these women working at this newspaper, you don't get to see a lot of the graphic nature of the lives that were lost in this case. It does show some photography, and there are some sort of scenes that show kind of the aftermath, but I would say all of that is tastefully done, if there is a possibility of showing murder in a tasteful way. It definitely, for me, was not as sort of chilling to witness as some of the scenes in the Jeffrey Dahmer series were. The Jeffrey Dahmer series, I couldn't even finish. It was just almost too true to life, and in a way that I felt like kind of glorified being a serial killer, whereas this one doesn't. It really kind of just takes it from more of that true crime drama angle and doesn't really show the killings very much, and really is respectful about all of the victims in this and kind of what it took to be able to point the finger at someone and say, we know for sure this is what's going on. The only thing that I would say that I maybe disliked about this film, and I don't even think that this is something that really counts as a dislike for the film entirely, is that they did kind of leave it a little bit open-ended or left some doubt there as to whether or not DeSalvo had committed all of the crimes. And I mean, I feel like I only say that because it is something that I feel like is pretty set in stone that he likely was the perpetrator of these acts, even though at the time, because of the restraints, DeSalvo was only ever connected to one of the murders with DNA. They were never able to really stick him with the other killings the way that they were. I think the last one was the only one that they were able to connect with DNA evidence. And there were 13 total women, I believe, that he did take their lives. So for the movie to kind of leave it a little bit open-ended, I understood the point to that, but I felt like they should have maybe committed a little bit more as far as letting everyone know that the serial killer was in fact caught. I don't believe that there were any other killings past the point that DeSalvo was taken into custody. And then obviously he did die in jail. So, you know, that kind of just stops the whole ability of him being able to get out and re-offend. But this movie, I thought, did a fantastic job. It is a little bit more on the slower end, but again, I don't think that it is meant to be, you know, really a film that looks at the serial killings specifically. I think a lot of it really comes from just what the two women had to do in terms of being able to get their voices heard, being respected for what they were able to discover during this time about the killings, and really being treated seriously in the 1960s as, you know, these voices that had a lot more of the information, really a lot of times than even the police department did. So I would definitely give this one a watch if you are interested in content that is similar to this, like if true crime is kind of up your alley and you enjoy movies and television series that stem around that. I think Boston Strangler is definitely a good one. I think both of the leading ladies in this did a phenomenal job as far as their portrayal of both of those characters. So for me, it was a nice film. It was good to watch and kind of interesting to see that perspective, because even though I knew about them, I didn't really know the details that kind of come out in this film about what they had done and how much they had contributed to DeSalvo in the end being caught. So very interesting for me. You guys are going to have to let me know what you thought of Boston Strangler. Subscribe if you like what I do here and you want to join the Movie Nerd family. You can find me on Instagram at Cinematic Sarcastic Podcast, and I hope to see you in the next episode.